Greyhound buses are still operating tonight on the nation's highways. Last night's strike deadline by union employees having been pushed back to Wednesday, while negotiations continued in Scottsdale, Arizona. End of traditional no-glamour news item. But it's not the end of the story, a story that will not receive much attention because it is about buses, considered the no-glamour, last resort way to go by most, except the poor, the young, and the elderly who have no choice. 1 year ago this month, few noticed as the intercity bus industry went the way of the airlines into deregulation, meaning most federal rules on routes and rates were eliminated or eased. The result has been a year of shuffle and turmoil, and Washington got an earful about it today. A Senate subcommittee held oversight hearings on bus deregulation 12 months later, and two principal concerns emerged: loss of bus service to many small towns around the country and a potential loss of safety with hundreds of new small companies entering the business. Here's how it went.
Tell us about safety fitness. Do you think that we have adequate standards and procedures?
We have been concerned enough to conduct some road checks. I recall one specifically that we did out at Yermo not so long ago. And we found one bus with absolutely no brakes. This is coming back from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, has to go down that San Bernardino grade. We found another one that only had one lug nut on one of the wheels. Mr. Gaillard, who's sitting next to me, has been involved in many other studies. We've recently had a two-bus accident coming down the grade from Reno back to California, where the driver was at fault and may be seriously prosecuted. So there is still a considerable safety problem in my view, and I think one that has to be addressed, and therefore I would certainly commend your efforts to get meaningful safety legislation passed. I certainly hope that comes. I don't believe we should have to wait until a bunch of bus passengers are incinerated at some country crossroads before we really give it the attention that it deserves.
1 year is not long enough to give us a clear picture of the long-term effects of bus deregulation. At least I hope it is not enough time, because the preliminary results paint a very bleak picture. Of the 14,000 communities whose transportation needs are served exclusively by intercity bus routes, about 10% have had service abandonments or are presently facing proposed discontinuation of services. 10%. And keep in mind that they have no alternative services. Where are these communities supposed to turn for alternative transportation? As a rural state senator from South Dakota who has witnessed dozens of railroad and airline abandonment cases in my home state since deregulation of those transportation services, I can assure everyone here today that there is nowhere else to turn. Rural America is continually and systematically being left out in the cold in the push for transportation deregulation.
We're going to make every possible conceivable effort we can to see that where service is essential, that substitute arrangements can be made. And it's going to take a while. It isn't going to happen overnight. As I said before, there will be some rough edges that are going to require some sandpapering as we move through the transition.
What does happen if service is discontinued? Do you know?
Well, I think that those people that can call on neighbors to carry them to the nearest community will do so. I think that some discretionary trips are eliminated. In certain cases, disasters occur. We received a letter from one lady who was receiving treatment for cancer in San Francisco due to a service adjustment, not an abandonment, but a timetable change. She was unable, or would have been unable, to make that type of treatment. This is one horror story, and there are dozens of these that we're getting. Fortunately for this lady, a service adjustment, a further adjustment was made, and she was able to make that trip. We think discretionary trips are being lost. We're not seeing the replacement services come into effect, Mr. Danforth, that had been discussed in the debate prior to passage of the act in California, at least.
We look further at the question of lost bus service to small-town America with a report from the state of Oregon, which lost 6 Greyhound routes just this last weekend. Kwame Holman is the reporter.
Since 1914, intercity buses have zigzagged the nation's highway system, making more stops and serving more people than trains and planes combined. And along America's back roads, the bus often has been the only mode of transportation for small-town residents. Western Oregon is timber country, where the roads wind through scenic woodlands and cities are few and far between. Small towns like Newport dot the Oregon coast, and for decades, people here have counted on Greyhound bus service to take them to the hospitals and schools in the inland population centers like Corvallis and Salem.
Corvallis, Salem, Portland.
But as of last Sunday, the Newport to Corvallis run is no longer part of Greyhound's or any other carrier's schedule. Following deregulation of their industry, Greyhound and other bus companies ended service to hundreds of small communities nationwide, deciding to concentrate on their most lucrative routes. In Oregon, that means 6 runs have come to an end, cutting off much of the state's western edge from any nearby public transportation to the Inland Valley. For Dennis Dick, Greyhound's depot manager in Newport, the cutbacks mean he will lose almost half of his freight business, but he is more concerned about the human impact.
The losers is the public, those people who depend on Greyhound, you know, the college students and the elderly primarily. They use this route to get to the valley and back. The distance between here and Corvallis is about 45 miles. If they wish to travel by bus, and many of them have no alternative, they'll have to take a 100-mile north trip and then come back 100 miles south. So in essence, it would be a 200-mile trip to cover 45 miles.
You change buses in Corvallis.
Is there a long wait, do you know?
You have about 30 minutes, a little over 30
thank
minutes.
you.
Can you manage that?
Oh, yeah, they're fine.
And for Mildred Corwin, it means fewer visits to her eye doctor and family in the valley. She has been taking this route since 1972, and today she rode the bus from Newport to Corvallis for the last time.
Perhaps there is not a large amount of profit on this line, but we are a county of retirees. And the Greyhound bus line is very important to those that are retired. So many are not physically strong, able to drive, or financially able to own a car.
College professor Bill Williams was one of 6 passengers on this bus. He's been riding the route for 15 years.
They have a right to make a profit, but they also have an obligation to serve the public within the terms of, you know, the basic concept of public service. They should be forced to provide a regular service into these kind of areas. I'm not willing to say it has to be every day, but yes, they have a public service responsibility.
In 1954, I think, my first time over this route, those years why our load was, half a bus or more, 3/4 of a bus load. I mean, I'm talking 20, 25 people at times. And it has been a good service, and they've needed it. I don't think it's fair for the company to have to provide service when the people are not using it. But on the other hand, I think we are a service company, so there is an obligation to a point of some of these people, they need transportation. When you go through Blodgett or Eddyville or some of these places, that these people have only one way to go, and that's by bus.
Well, when I wish to go into the valley to visit my family and help care for my grandchildren, I do not see any way that I can reach the valley. That's something in the future that one will have to work out if this bus discontinues.
Bus service here was discontinued, but not before a fight between Greyhound and Oregon's Public Utilities Commissioner, John Lobdell.
It's clear that at least the Greyhound Corporation want to restrict their activities to the high volume, high revenue, high profit routes, which is up and down the freeways between major metropolitans here. That then leaves the problems in the states of providing service from the larger metropolitan areas to the small communities and between the small communities. The gut issue is that since we are granting them a specialized license to operate a specialized service, should we as states be entitled to expect them to provide a subsidy to some rural communities from their high-traffic, high-profit routes.
Do you think Greyhound cares at all for these people that are out there stranded?
No, not at all. I think that they're just numbers on a P&L statement to Greyhound.
The specific arguments over the effect of bus deregulation vary from state to state. But here, the reality is that a company that has played a major role in moving small-town America is about to leave many of those towns behind.
Greyhound, even with deregulation, remains the dominant force in the bus industry with its 3,800 buses, which carried 57 million passengers last year alone. Trailways, its major competitor, has half of Greyhound's revenues. The Oregon towns are among 1,100 stops Greyhound is eliminating nationwide. The states most affected are Indiana, Texas, California, Georgia, and Alabama. It is also starting service on 38 new routes. The company's senior vice president is William McCracken. First, Mr. McCracken, the Oregon commissioner says that Greyhound doesn't care about these people as individuals.
Well, I would disagree with that. We care about any passenger. Passengers are revenue. The route that was discussed here, they said there were 6 passengers on the bus. That was much above average. The studies we did indicated less than an average of 4 people a day riding that schedule. That barely pays for the tags and the taxes.
Well, what are the economics of that? Explain that.
The revenue on that run would have probably averaged about 30 cents for each mile. The cost of operating it was $2.30 a mile. So we were losing $2 every mile we operated.
And is that the case in most of the route abandonments that you have filed for or are working on at this moment?
I would say this one, where you had an average load of 4, is much better than the typical route that we're abandoning. The typical route we're abandoning, there was testimony today at the hearing on Iowa. We averaged half a passenger a day on those routes. Half a passenger a day.
All right. What about the gut issue, as the man in Oregon said, is that Greyhound, regardless of whether or not it's losing money on these routes, Greyhound or any other bus company for that matter, that you have a public service obligation to provide that service?
When we were a regulated industry, obviously the profitable routes could subsidize the unprofitable. We're a deregulated industry now. Those so-called profitable routes are subject to intensive competition from new bus companies and existing companies expanding their networks. We don't have the protection anymore that regulation used to provide us to develop the funds from the profitable route to subsidize the unprofitable.
So the man was right then when he said that Greyhound and presumably Trailways and the other major companies are all concentrating on the high volume routes at this point.
We're concentrating on the routes where at least we can make variable costs. Maybe not full cost, but at least variable cost. We have to get rid of those routes that are a substantial drain on our operations, but it's not a significant portion. In Oregon, it's less than 2% of our operation is covered in these 6 routes.
Why were you able to provide service to these various towns when you were a regular? Why have the economics changed so dramatically?
Well, I think you heard a comment in that film that many, many years ago, a lot of people rode the bus to those communities. That is true. As the American family over the last 40 years is much more likely to have an automobile, more affluent, more able to use the automobile on the interstate highways that the government spent hundreds of billions for, we've seen our traffic dry up in many of those areas.
And it's not coming back?
It's not coming back in those areas where traffic today is down to maybe 1 person a week getting on at a bus stop.
Thank you. One of the senators, as we saw, who raised the most serious concerns about the impact of bus deregulation on rural America was Larry Pressler, Republican of South Dakota. Senator Pressler opposed deregulation when it was first proposed, and as we heard, he still does. Senator, have your pre-deregulation fears pretty well been borne out by the experience?
Very much so. It's like a cancer in the rural areas and small towns and in a lot of cities that is depriving the elderly of transportation, of young people, of lower incomes. Let me say that I don't necessarily blame Greyhound. I blame Congress for passing what I think is a very bad bill, the deregulation bill, which is really re-regulation. I think we've got to correct it to stop some of these abandonments. I believe we've got to stick to the common carrier responsibility of the early 1930s, which provides that if you have some rich routes, you've got to have some poor routes, because we're really hurting people who need to travel. There is as much as 40% abandonment in many small towns and rural areas, and some of these are suburbs of bus transportation. And these are people who are quiet. They don't have lobbyists in Washington. They're the elderly, poor people, students, and so forth who use this bus transportation. And it's not, replacement service is not springing up.
Are you a lonely voice on this, Senator, or is there a serious effort underway to re-regulate the bus industry?
Well, I was the only vote against bus deregulation in the Commerce Committee, and I want to compliment this program because it's the first time a national news show has done a program on this, and I've been working on it for 2 years. There's very little interest in it.
Why?
I don't know. It's amazing to me because it's essential transportation for a lot of people who don't have very much clout. Now, some of the bus companies say that there are more entries, but that is charter bus service, where people are going on vacations or here or there. But in terms of the scheduled route that somebody can count on to get on a bus to go someplace, those are being canceled out, and we don't have the train or planes in rural and small town areas. This deregulation of airplanes, trains, and buses has been a disaster and will become more so in the next 2 or 3 years as it becomes apparent that it's going to break down our total national transportation system, and especially in the area of bus transportation.
Do you think that Mr. McCracken and Greyhound should be ordered to run buses over routes where they only have a half a passenger a load, or even that Oregon route that had an average of 4 or 6?
Well, that's a half a passenger per stop. There can be many more passengers per load. They shouldn't be ordered to run a major bus over that area, but there can be a smaller bus. But if they have some very rich routes, they should be willing to take some marginal routes. Now, we can't maintain all the same routes forever, but I'm co-sponsor of a bill in Congress that will slow down the abandonment process, make it much more difficult. I think we have to go back to a form of regulation that will ensure a transportation system that if you have very rich routes between 2 cities, you're also going to take some poorer routes. That's the way our national transportation system was built in rail, air, and in bus transportation, and we're abandoning it, and it's like a cancer that we're going to wake up in 2 or 3 years and not have commerce moving and not having a lot of people getting around who need to get around.
Mr. McCracken, does Greyhound want to go back to the way it was?
Let me make our position clear. In the late 70s, we were very disturbed about the state the regulation was in. We had free entry at the ICC and many states. Anyone could come in over our lucrative routes, as the senator calls them. But we couldn't abandon service, discontinue service. We couldn't change our schedules. We couldn't change our fares because of state regulation. We would have preferred to go back to that type of regulation that was known in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. We didn't think that was politically achievable. The second best choice, deregulate the industry.
And so that's your position now?
That's our position now. We think it should go further, total deregulation.
What's total deregulation?
That would, right now you have a paperwork maze at the ICC and at each of the state regulatory agencies that we have to go through. And it serves no purpose, absolutely no purpose at all other than to generate a lot of paper and delay.
I think it goes without saying, Senator, you would be opposed to complete deregulation, right?
That's right, and I think Greyhound makes some good points. And I'm not blaming Greyhound so much as I'm blaming Congress and also most of the media, because this thing is happening without anybody paying any attention to it. And we're soon going to have all these ads on TV about special rates between 2 big cities and about coupons that you can get for traveling to places that are much traveled, while all the rest of the country doesn't have any transportation. And we're just within 2 or 3 years of that, not only in buses but also in airlines and railroads, but especially the buses that carry the elderly and students and lower income people who aren't making any noise and nobody's paying any attention to it.
Mr. McCracken, as you know, your colleagues, your competitors in the bus industry see Greyhound correctly as kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the industry because you dominate the field so big. Greyhound is really not hurting that badly, is it, as a result of deregulation? And won't you, if there are survivors, you will be the survivor, correct?
I don't think, as far as new service is concerned, you haven't seen the full impact of bus deregulation yet. Although so far, carriers have applied to expand the bus network by over 17%, which is pretty phenomenal. There is more expansion going on than contraction.
Expansion on new routes or on existing routes?
Both. New carriers coming in on a route that one carrier had exclusively in the past. We thought that was the whole theory of deregulation. Eliminate the exclusivity. Let us go in and compete like any other business competes.
What's wrong with that, Senator?
Because you have a common carrier responsibility. If you take some very rich routes, you should also take some routes that are not so rich. Indeed, in some cases, provide a service. And if the companies divide that up, then everybody gets some transportation. Now, you can't provide transportation everywhere to everybody in every remote area.
But your point is that with the competitive atmosphere will never cause Greyhound and Trailways, say, to compete down a route that there aren't a lot of passengers who want to ride their buses.
That's right. Nearly 30% of all the local stops in Iowa are being abandoned, for example. And that's because, but the companies that are doing that are just taking the very rich routes, and the rest of it is just being forgotten about. There is some public responsibility, some common carrier responsibility to even things out, and that helps the commerce of the whole country.
But Greyhound, in this environment now, does not agree with that, correct? I mean, you're not going to run routes if you're going to lose money on it.
I think the answer to that is the answer to the senator's inquiry: why hasn't the media covered it? Because it's not a story. It's a non-event. People are not being harmed by the discontinuances of service that were unneeded to begin with, and that's why there's little hue and cry. You mentioned Indiana earlier as being one of those significantly affected. The Indiana legislature just this summer decided to deregulate on a local basis. Now, those local elected officials close to the people obviously aren't concerned.
But you say there are people out there being hurt, Senator.
In the state of Iowa, a study we had testimony this morning, 30% of the small towns and stops have been abandoned. There'll be many more. This means that these people will not have service. Now, they say there's a substitute service springing up. If you look into it, it's maybe once a week, or it's something very irregular, something that nobody can complain about, something that you can't depend upon. So we're in a situation that I believe, and my office has statistics, is from 30 to 50% of the small town bus service will be gone by the end of this year.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Robin?